Okay, so this morning we're going to be discussing, as you know, the art of well-being. And just before we get into it, just a couple of this talk's objectives. So basically, we're going to discuss this idea of well-being from a Vedantic perspective and examine it as a state per se, a means to getting there, and also the state itself. As well as that, we're going to be having a look at an evaluative well-being, and I'll explain that later when we get there, and its relation to the various aspects of our lives. And this is a sort of common idea, if you were, you would get if you looked up well-being, and it covers various aspects within our lives. And then obviously we're going to look just briefly at some of the techniques and practices that can ensure that we move towards and try and help us attain this state of more permanent human maturity, or what we call as well-being. So when we define well-being, and if you go and have a look on the internet, there are a lot of definitions in terms of well-being, and you'll get a lot of answers, and there's a lot of information out there. And some of the definitions and some of what you're going to see are a little bit different to how we're going to ultimately define it. So if you just take a simple dictionary definition, you'll get, and what it says in the beginning, a good or satisfactory condition of existence, a state characterized by health, happiness, and prosperity, which is a lot in line with this evaluative analysis when we talk of well-being. So and usually when we look at this definition, this is the common conception of well-being. And it's sort of associated with some sort of emotional fluctuation, some positive experience because of something good that has happened to us. So we get into this state because of a good experience. Probably something a little bit closer to where we're moving to is this concept. It's actually a Greek word, eudaimonia, and that is the condition of human flourishing or of living well. So this moves sort of a little bit further away from the classical dictionary definition into a more sort of philosophical definition of what well-being is. In fact, this segues into what we're going to be discussing in terms of well-being, and that is an abiding or stable sense of satisfaction in and through the various fluctuations of your life at the physical, emotional, and intellectual levels. So in other words, you attain a state of fulfillment, of happiness, of subjective well-being within yourself, even though you may be subjected to a whole lot of changes, a whole lot of ups and downs, fluctuations at not only the physical level, that's at the level of your body, at the emotional level, as well as at the intellectual level. But we'll get onto that more as we progress through. Okay, so happiness or subjective well-being. And again, you're going to hear a lot of sort of words, and we use these in a way as sort of synonyms. And we can say that the subjective well-being or well-being is the same as happiness or even peace, satisfaction, fulfillment. They all mean more or less the same things. And what you'll appreciate in, and why we say they're all synonyms, is because they're all the fundamental pursuit of a human being. If I were to ask any one of you, what is it that you want from life? What is it that you're looking for? Okay, granted, every one of you in the room, and 22 of us here, will say something different. You may say, no, I want to be, if I rise into this position, that's really what I want from life. Or I just want to happy, healthy family, or I want to go to the moon. Everyone will have these different objectives that they want to achieve. But if we bring it down fundamentally, what that actually means is that we want to do these things, but because we believe that these things will bring us a sense of happiness, a sense of well-being. So in fact, the primary pursuit of every human being is happiness, is well-being. Now, there are many ways to get there, and often we go about it in the wrong way. And this is what we're going to try and correct in this talk, is providing you a means by which you can attain this permanent state of well-being, as opposed to this fluctuation, which we term as happiness. So when we perform our actions, what we have to appreciate is that every action that we perform, whether that be a thought, a word, or a deed, we perform it because we believe that we are going to gain a greater degree of happiness by performing it. Why would you launch on any endeavor unless you believe it's going to bring you a better state that you're in than what you are in presently? For instance, I am thirsty. So I believe that by getting up and going and getting a drink of water is going to put me in a better state than what I'm in now. So in fact, when you break down your day, you'll find that almost all your actions are dedicated or directed towards attaining a state better than what you're in now. That is a pursuit of happiness. A better state is a more improved, more lively, more peaceful state of being. There's a quote that I want to share with you, and this is from A. Parthasarathhi's work, the Vedanta Treatise, the Eternities. And very interesting what he says in the book. He says, your primary service to the world, your religious duty, is to keep yourself peaceful and cheerful. To be sorrowful and miserable is a social, moral, religious crime. You ought not to spread the disease of melancholy to your fellow beings. Instead, rejuvenate their health with joy and happiness. So from this quote, we can clearly see that it's one's duty to be cheerful. And again, here, cheerful could mean that subjective state of happiness. How pleasure it is to meet someone who's in that state of happiness or in that effervescing joy, as opposed to someone who is miserable, melancholic. He says, if you get into that melancholic state, isolate, stay at home. It's best not to go out and spread that disease. So what he's encouraging us here to do is to get into this joyful, productive, happy state, because it's contagious. You'll find if you've ever met a bubbly personality or someone that's just really happy, it rubs off on you. Hey, I met this guy the other day, such a great character. He was always so happy. You almost feel happy just by association. Similarly, someone who's miserable all the time, grumbling, moaning, no one really wants to be around a person like that. So again, this comes to making sure that we move towards a state of happiness. And I think every one of us can appreciate that, of course, this is what we want to drive towards. We want to drive towards a state of happiness, a state of peace, a state of subjective well-being. Nobody wants to be miserable and unhappy. So let's just be clear what we mean by happiness. And we're trying to understand. And when I say happiness, again, I'm using it in the context of well-being. So what is happiness not? This is one of the ways one of the techniques we use, a learning technique we use to try and understand something, is by negating all the things that it is not. So when we say what is happiness? Well, let me tell you what it's not. So happiness is not merely not being happy or not being sorrowful, or having the absence of frustration, or having the absence of, an agitated state, absence of grumpiness. That's not really happiness. In the Shastras, in the scriptures, they use these two words, sukha and dukkha. And sukha means happiness, dukkha means sorrow. So when we talk about the subjective well-being, we're not just meaning the absence of sorrow, because you may say, well, if I'm not sorrowful, if I'm not miserable, that must mean the opposite of that is happy. So we're not referring to the subjective well-being in that sense. Again, where, as I said before, it's not just merely being devoid of dukkha, of sorrow. Happiness neither is an emotional fluctuation. Now, when I say emotional fluctuation, you may say, so what are you saying, Craig, that if I acquire a new car and I experience this elation, that's not happy? Well, yes, happiness in the sense of it's a fluctuating emotion. But we're not referring to that in terms of our subjective well-being. No doubt you experience many of these emotional fluctuations, these expressions of happiness throughout one's life. But that has no real correlation to our overall and overarching sense of well-being. And what we're attempting to understand is, what is that state? What is that sense of well-being? What is that I can achieve where I am? Remember, if we go back to the original definition, that abiding sense of happiness that is independent of these fluctuations in the world. So again, when we go through this happiness, when we experience happiness, we are associating, and one of the ways in which we can define happiness is a temporary cessation of agitation. This is the way happiness is defined. So you have some agitation because you want something, whatever it is. It could be, again, you want to quench your thirst. So you're a little agitated, you feel a bit parched. So in order to quench your thirst, you get up, take some water. What's happened? That agitation has ceased. You're no longer bothered by that thirst. So you feel satisfied. Great. No? Have a drink of water. I feel great now. That agitation is gone. So that's one of the ways in which we define happiness, cessation of agitation. Now, we usually go about achieving that state, achieving that happiness by contacting the world. We contact the world in order to be happy. Why would we go to anything that makes us sad? Why would we go to anything that makes us miserable? We wouldn't really. We tend to gravitate or direct our actions towards those things that are going to improve our current condition, improve our state of happiness. And why do we do that? Well, we believe that happiness lies in contacting the world. And when I say contacting the world, what I mean by that is contacting the objects and beings, sense objects and beings of the world. If I get that particular person, if just for a moment, if I had that interaction, I'd be happy. Or if I get this thing, or if I get this job, or if I get this promotion, then I'll be happy. So we believe that the joy, the happiness that we are attempting to gain from life lies in the objects and beings. I'm not saying that's wrong, but let's analyze. Why is it that we so firmly believe that the joy we want from life is in the objects and beings of the world? Well, look at our experience. Look what we go through. when we go through an experience, when we acquire the object of our desire, the being of our desire, what happens? Well, we get this feeling. It's a positive feeling. So what happens is the mind ends up setting up this association. The mind associates this feeling, this elated feeling of happiness, of joy, with a particular object or being. So we tend then to confuse this outward experience, because you are outwardly contacting some experience, with inner joy. Again, we're not saying that this isn't happiness. You can't tell me, Craig, that by contacting that delicious piece of chocolate cake, there's no happiness. I get a happiness from that. Or I get a real happiness from playing a round of golf. Or I get a real happiness going for a walk with my loved one. You're saying there's no happiness in that? I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's a happiness that is derived from contacting the world. That's the happiness we all perceive. But again, this is not the subjective sense of well-being that we are driving towards, driving to achieve. And why is that? Because all the happinesses, all the joys that we derive from the world are false, because, can anybody answer that? Why is this a false sense of happiness? Why is this a false sense of joy? Anybody?
The happiness is not in the object.
Well, we've said that you go to an object or being to derive that happiness, you get it, and then you're happy. So we can't really say that it's not in there. We can, if you go through it a different way. But why is that happiness false, let's say? Temporary, there we go. You're right, Craig, but the answer I'm looking for is it is temporary. Not only is it temporary, it's fleeting. It lasts for a little while. Even if you get something major, let's say you get a new car. Really happy. Wow, things are great. Just got a new car. Did you see my new car? Things are good. But how long does that last for? Month, 2 months? You speak to your friend, hey, how's your new car after half a year? You know. So it's good, it's going well. He's definitely not at that same state or degree of happiness that he was when he got it. So it's temporary, it wanes. Furthermore, what we have to appreciate from this happiness, this type of happiness, is that it has diminishing value. The example that we always use is the example of, bearing in mind I was educated in India, so the example we always use is mango season. Mango season comes around once a year. It's not like, you get mangoes all year round in some countries. And you go into a shopping center in America, and mangoes are there every day of the year. Don't know what you're talking about. No, in India, they come around once a year. A long period. I think it's maybe 9 months, not a mango to be seen. And then all of a sudden, you can feel the excitement coming, and mango season's about to arrive. And then finally, you get blessed with the first mango of the season. And your friend comes and says, hey, listen, I've just been gifted this box. Would you like a mango? Oh, please, please. Oh, that would be amazing. That first mango, there's nothing like it. Because it usually comes also in the heat of summer. So it's how nature works. It's amazing. That first mango you have. Brilliant. So tasty, so juicy. Dripping down your face. You don't even bother. He says, it looks like you enjoyed that mango. Would you like another one? You say, sure, yeah, I'll have another one. Yeah, that'd be great. And you eat it and a little bit less slowly, and it's nice. Definitely not as good as the first one. He offers you a third, or a fourth. The fifth one, you can't eat. It's a torture. What's changed? Nothing's really changed. The mango's the same. It's not that you got a frot mango. Mango's the same. Taste buds are the same. What's happened? Diminishing value. Repeated contact brings you to a point of zero enjoyment. And this is true of the contact born of the world. So we can't really say that this contacting the world is going to bring us any permanent state of subjective well-being. Just to touch on what Craig said, furthermore to that is that we believe that it's in the objects and beings of the world. We believe the joy there, and the mind makes this association, as I said, with it being there because of the reaction it gets by contacting it. But a simple illustration will prove otherwise. I say to you, if that's the case, then a particular object should offer that same joy to everybody, or that particular object should offer the same disgust to everybody. It's not the same. I'll give you an example, simple example, cigarette. Cigarette brings so much joy to some people. You see the smokers when they smoke. I don't know, if you're looking for shanti, if you're looking for peace, you'll find it in the smoker's face when he has a cigarette. Amazing. Another person sitting next to him is going, how can you do that to your lungs? That smell is disgusting. I don't even know why you haven't given up this habit. Detests it. So if it were true that happiness lay in the objects and beings of the world, then it should provide the same to everybody, and it doesn't. This is why this is a false sense of happiness. It's not permanent, and it has diminishing value. Now, this leads us on to this idea of desires. And again, we're contacting the world for what? For happiness. We're pursuing happiness. How? By contacting the things we want. In other words, we're driven to find this state of peace by contacting the world or fulfilling our desires. Now, why is it? Why is it that we go to the world to fulfill our desires? Well, this arises because we have some sort of feeling that our life without that thing or that person is incomplete. It's unfulfilled. And therefore, I will go to that thing to fulfill it, or I will go to that person to complete it. It's like hunger in another way. You know, when you feel hungry, you got a hunger pain, they call it. So what do? That feeling of emptiness in your stomach, that feeling of wanting, that feeling of needing in your stomach drives you where? Drives you towards food. You have the food, you're no longer hungry. So we have this void within, this hunger within, this feeling of incompleteness within. That drives us towards the world to gain some sense of fulfillment, to gain some sense of satisfaction, to gain happiness. Now, when our thoughts go to the world to fill that feeling of incompleteness, this thought flow is called as desire. So, I have a feeling of emptiness. What's that feeling of emptiness? A partner. Must have a partner in life. So what happens? There's that feeling of lacking, of wanting. So what happens? My thoughts start going towards some particular being. I'm not saying me. I'm just giving this example. Thoughts start going towards perhaps in church that Sunday you saw somebody, or maybe at the disco on Friday you met somebody. Your thoughts start going towards that person. Those thoughts that you establish that run towards that person or towards that object, these are called as desires. And this is important because this is going to establish what is preventing our overarching sense of subjective well-being. So what happens? Until we get that particular object or being, until we get the girl, until we get the piece of chocolate cake, we're agitated. So when our desires, so we have these desires, these thought flows that flowing towards these objects or beings, these desires, let's call them. When these desires are not met, for whatever reason, we're left with desires being unfulfilled, unfulfilled desires, we'll call them. Have a desire, desire cannot be fulfilled, we have unfulfilled desires. Unfulfilled desires create in our minds this mental agitation. We get agitated. That mental agitation manifests as a state of sorrow, a state of displeasure, a state of dis-ease. This state is opposite of well-being. So we can say that unfulfilled desires are the cause of our displeasure. This state, as I said, state opposite of well-being. Then you say to me, okay, so surely we just need to fulfill our desires, follow our desires, and then we're happy, right? Well, here's an equation. Happiness is equivalent to the number of desires fulfilled over the number of desires entertained. Now, looking at the equation, you'll say, well, that supports what I was thinking, Craig. Surely if I just fulfill all my desires, I'm increasing the numerator. That means my quantum of happiness is increasing, right? You provided the equation, and the equation is saying that. So, well, I can't disagree with you. That's true mathematically. The more desires you fulfill, the happier you will be. Bingo. Let me just go out and get myself a lot of money, a lot of resources, and then I'll be happy. Well, we all know that's not true. In fact, I watched a very interesting episode. What would you call it? A short sort of collection of interviews with some of the very wealthy, famous people in the world. And the common thread was that, yes, their wealth had brought them the ability to do certain things, but in no way had it brought them a sense of satisfaction, a sense of well-being. So we all know this, that we can't necessarily equate wealth with money. So all these resources to go and fulfill all these desires is not going to bring us a sense of happiness. But that's not purely the reason why. The fundamental reason behind it is that when we go out to indiscriminately contact these desires that we have in the mind, what happens is we fulfill that desire. in fulfilling those particular desires, what we don't realize is we are adding fuel to the fire of the mind. The mind's nature, and the mind is the seat of our desires. The mind's nature is that it is insatiable. So the more desires that we fulfill, in fact, what's happening is the more desires we are creating. I'll give an example. You go to your favorite Italian restaurant and you want to order your penne arrabbiata, favorite meal. You go in there and you order the meal. You go in there, you got a single desire. And while you're sitting there, you're waiting for your meal, you see the waiter walk past. What has he got? This beautiful looking piece of cake. Oh my goodness, what is that? Oh, sir, this is tiramisu. You haven't tasted? Wait, after your meal, I'll bring you one. You'll never look back. And off he goes. Oh, you're eating your pasta and you're already thinking about the next thing. Already you've got the next desire. You haven't even filled the first one and you already got the next one. You can see what's happening. Then another person walks past as you're having your tiramisu with a small shot of black liquid. What is that? It smells so aromatic, flavorsome, flavorful. What is that? So that is espresso you never had? I'll bring you one straight after your dessert. And now you're thinking of that. So you get up after your meal, you leave the restaurant, and what's happened? You had one desire, which you fulfilled. And now you've left with 3 desires. So you can appreciate that no matter how many desires you fulfill, if you're indiscriminately fulfilling those desires, what you're doing is you're increasing the denominator here because you're increasing the number of desires you're entertaining too. Therefore, any increase in denominator is decreasing the overall sense of happiness. That is why nobody is happy, because everyone is basing their lives on merely contacting more and more, merely fulfilling their desires, their wants and needs in order to gain happiness. This is why it doesn't happen. What we're trying to understand, what we're trying to get to terms with is, what is a genuine happiness then? Remember, the subjective well-being, this overarching sense of happiness, is something we know now that is independent of external fluctuations, is independent of something external to us. See, anything genuine is not dependent on external circumstances for its existence. I'll give you a simple example that you can probably relate to, and that's love, or should I say true love. Shakespeare defines it or says about true love: alters not when altercation finds. In other words, true love remains constant. It doesn't change. Oh, I love my husband. And the next day, oh my God, that guy is irritating me so much. You won't believe what he did. And you're mad with that person. That is not love. Love is constant. You find this in Othello, and going back to Shakespeare. Othello, he's married to Desdemona. And anyway, to spare you all the details, Othello suspects his wife of infidelity. And he really puts her through the ringer. And at the end, he's saying to her, listen, I'm going to kill you. Have you said your prayers, Desdemona? I cannot kill an unprepared soul. He's going to kill her. Already, he's been speaking to her foully. He's undermined her character. By the way, she's deemed as one of the most purest characters in Shakespeare, most benign feminine character. He's done all these horrible things. And at the end, he's about to kill her. And even then, her love is so solid. Her love is so genuine. Her love is so true that she says, commend me unto my Lord. She still refers to him as my Lord. So this is an example of something genuine, true love. Anything you'll appreciate, anything genuine has its own intrinsic reality. And what I mean by that is a flame. We can appreciate that a flame is genuine. We can see it, we can feel it. So the intrinsic reality of a flame is heat, that we know. So apply this in the context of the joy derived from the objects of the world. So we are contacting the sense objects for pleasure, but the sense objects have no joy content therein. Why? We've already covered this. This is the point that Craig brought up earlier. Why? Because they have different effects on different people. There's no intrinsic reality within those particular sense objects for our happiness or joy. Again, it comes back to that same point. And this is something that you should be, I'm repeating it and I'm attacking it from different sides so you can start appreciating that the state of well-being that we're looking for is not dependent on circumstances external to ourselves, is not dependent on the beings of the world. It's not dependent on those objects of the world. Say, well, where is it, Craig? When are you going to tell us where it is or what it is? To which I'll give you a famous quote by Arthur Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer says, it is difficult to find happiness within oneself, but it is impossible to find anywhere else. Difficult to find. Nobody says attaining a permanent state of subjective well-being or happiness is easy. It requires a lot of effort. But you won't find it anywhere else. In other words, you won't find it in the world. So when we look at Vedanta, it says that this subjective state of well-being is independent of external circumstances. And it's not in the objects and beings of the world, but how we relate to the world, how we relate to those things. And our relationship with the world is determined predominantly by our mind's disposition. This is getting closer now to what we mean by the subjective state of well-being. Therefore, when we talk about happiness, we are talking about a state of mind. Remember the quote. Within oneself. The mind is within you. So this state of well-being rests in oneself. It is dependent on the mind being equanimous, being peaceful, being calm. It's like a lake. You see a lake when it is still. There's no ripples. It's an amazing sight. You see the reflection. You see the reflection of everything around you. That's very different to a lake that is tossed and turned by the wind. When the wind pulls up, you see there's a lot of ripples and you can't even go skiing anymore. In fact, you tell your children, hey, careful, don't play in there. The waves are coming now. It is turmoil. The same with one's mind. When the mind is peaceful, when their mind is in a state of mental equanimity or poise, you are in a happy state. When the mind is agitated, when the mind is out of sync, you are in a disturbed state. You're in a unhappy place. So, therefore, joy is within us. And that's what Arthur Schopenhauer says. It's in our own minds. So by now we should have a sort of little bit of a deeper understanding as to what we mean by this happiness, true happiness, as opposed to false happiness. But how do we achieve this? How do we render the mind calm? How do we bring this sense of peace, joy, poise to our personality? So there's two methods. The first is developing the intellect. Now, for those who don't know, a human being is a composition of a body, mind, and intellect. Body, we're not going to look into too much. We all know what the body is. Mind is the seat of our emotions, our desires, our likes, our dislikes, attractions, aversions, memory. These are all associated with the mind. The intellect is that faculty of discretion, that which reasons, judges, decides. I'm not going too much into this, but these are the three aspects of our personality. Now, the intellect is the most subtle equipment we have. And that equipment alone can control the mind. It is the only equipment that has the ability to control the vagaries of the mind. So we've already established, if we want this subjective sense of well-being, we need to establish within ourselves a sense of calm and peace. That calm and peace is disrupted by these desires in the mind, especially when they're unfulfilled. Creates these agitations. It puts the ripples in our lake. And what happens? We're in this state of unhappiness, dis-ease. So what the intellect does, has this ability, once fortified, once developed, to control the mind. So that's the first method, or the first practice by which we can start moving towards a sense of subjective well-being. The second one, what we're going to examine, the second method by which we can attain more permanent state of happiness, is by removing the desires themselves, by eliminating those desires that do not serve our best interest. And this is done through integrated self-development practices. So we're going to have a look at those. Now, I talked earlier about this evaluative sense of well-being. And what you have to appreciate, and this is sort of in general literature, they talk about these various degrees or these various aspects within our life where we strive for this sense of well-being. And these I've listed already. So economic well-being, obviously this is when our basic needs, the ability to meet our basic needs, to feel a sense of security. Physical well-being is, these are sort of more our lifestyle choices that affect the functioning of our physical bodies. Social well-being is the ability to relate to others, to maintain meaningful relationships and a sense of empathy. Emotional or psychological well-being is the ability to maintain an awareness and governance over our emotions. It is also the ability to increase the purity and depth of our emotions, emotional, psychological well-being. Intellectual well-being is the development of a clarity of thought and originality of thinking, which supports this overarching sense of mental equanimity and composure. Finally, spiritual well-being is the integration of meaning and purpose in life. And this is connected to our inner selves or to nature or to some greater or higher power. Now, I'm not going to get into economic or physical well-being. There's enough literature out there that you can examine that, and there's no real sort of philosophical purpose in examining those areas. But we're going to have a look especially at this bottom four. But the first thing that you have to appreciate is that in order to attain any social, emotional, intellectual, or spiritual well-being, what is the fundamental ingredient in the attainment of all of these is intellectual maturity or intellectual development. And this is paramount for a sense of well-being. As soon as you're able to develop the intellect, you'll find that all these other areas, all these other aspects of your life are looked into and taken care of. This is the power of having a sharp, attuned, developed, well-mature intellect. So what the intellect does is it conceives of a more mature state of existence. And what I mean by that is only the intellect has the ability to pursue something beyond what is presently experienced and known. The mind itself tends to wallow in this known experience. It wallows in what it knows. It doesn't like to explore. In fact, one of the characteristics of the intellect is exploratory nature. It has the capacity to move into realms of unknown. Now, we'll appreciate in the context of self-development, in moving towards a more mature state of personality or subjective well-being, we will need to move from where we are to something that we are not yet. That something we are not yet is potentially a better state. So the intellect can conceive that. Through knowledge, it can project that. And then start through these integrated self-development practices, start moving the personality towards their achievement. Now, many of you in the room have been studying for a while, and you'll appreciate that in order to do this, in order to develop the intellect, there's two methods we employ. One is taking nothing for granted. The second is questioning everything. So these are two simple methods. And this is why we lean on philosophy, because philosophy gives us this opportunity to question. It presents certain concepts and ideas by which we should not take things for granted and question them to develop our own understanding of them. So appreciating this overarching faculty of the intellect and what it does, we're just going to look into briefly these aspects of social well-being and emotional well-being. So again, as we've already mentioned, it is your social obligation to be happy. Every human being's social obligation is to be happy. Again, it's contagious. Morosity is also contagious and pulls everyone down. So what we mean by this social well-being is the ability to be able to relate to one another. Effectively, what social well-being boils down to is maintaining and cultivating meaningful relationships. Now, how does one do this? That's a whole nother hour's discussion, building authentic relationships. We're not going to get into it. But one of the ways in which we can do this is by developing a sense of empathy. Looking into the needs of others before our own. This leads into a very important aspect of gaining a subjective sense of well-being. That is removing unselfishness. Sorry, someone has unmuted themselves and is disturbing. So we want to try and develop this sense of empathy, this feeling towards this, looking into the needs of others as opposed to our own. That's not to say you neglect yourself. What we mean by this is you're becoming less and less selfish. Now, one of the ways in which we can improve this is a gratitude practice. Being thankful for the things that you have. That gratitude practice, what it does is it helps us to not only appreciate what we have, but it almost segues into this ability to start feeling, what is all I have that others don't have? What may others need? So this practice and this idea can help in improving our social sense of well-being. When we talk about psychological well-being, what we're talking about is emotional well-being. And as we know, it is a human prerogative to experience emotions. Again, we're not trying to move away from the experience of emotions. In Vedanta, it's often criticized. You guys are all intellect. No scope for emotions. No scope for experiencing any emotions. Very cold and dry. That's not it. In order to experience a full existence as human beings, we want to have the experience of emotions. Now, emotions are a virtue, but not when they overtake the personality. When emotions override the personality, one becomes emotional. And when you are overpowered or dictated by those emotions, and this is nothing but the demands of the mind. Remember, the emotions are seated in the mind itself. So when your emotions overpower your personality, you lose control. And any of you will appreciate that has a string of negative repercussions. People will say, when you're angry, don't make any rash decisions. You sometimes, you get into a fit of rage and you say things that you don't mean. These all have negative repercussions. So any of us will appreciate that it's not in our best interest to let the dictates of the mind, to let this emotional outburst determine our actions. Or we should not base any of our actions from the state of heightened emotional response. That is the opposite of psychological well-being. So in order to achieve psychological well-being, we must have emotions. We should feel emotions, but those emotions need to be kept in check. They needed to be under the governance and guidance of a well-developed, well-strengthened intellect. Spiritual well-being. What is spiritual well-being? So, of course, when we talk about spiritual well-being, it is moving towards a state of values, and those values are inherent values within your own personality, values that you hold true, and all of your lives are run on those values. Whatever your values are at present, those determine your thoughts, your actions in life. If you have a value for money, you will be in pursuit of wealth. You will potentially befriend friends that have wealth, etc., etc., etc. If you have a value for physical well-being, you will pursue that. You will have friends that are into going to the gym or into jogging or running. So all of your values determine your life. Now, spiritual well-being is increasing those values or pursuing higher values in life. If you are actively pursuing higher values, you are looking into your spiritual well-being. So this is achieved through philosophy and religion, because both philosophy and religion give the practitioner an insight into the true meaning and purpose of life. Not only that, both help establish a method by which to attain an ultimate sense of fulfillment and well-being. So up until now, we've been talking about attaining a state of mental equanimity, a state of mental peace, a state of subjective well-being that doesn't fluctuate. It becomes closer and closer to being unaffected by any external fluctuations. Your partner shouts at you. It shouldn't affect your well-being. Your kids do badly at school. It shouldn't affect your well-being. Your kids do good at school. Shouldn't affect your subjective well-being, because you are subjectively well. You're being well. So what now the spiritual slant takes is the spiritual aspect, and religion and philosophy, especially Vedanta philosophy, it points to the state of absolute or ultimate fulfillment and well-being. This is the name given by many various sects of philosophy and religion, is called nirvana, samadhi, enlightenment, self-realization, attainment, the becoming. They all mean the same thing. It is a state of permanent, absolute peace, happiness, and bliss. And again, this is the ultimate pursuit of every individual. Of course, we can experience it relatively when we are less and less affected by the fluctuations in the external world. But only when we attain that exalted state do we experience this sense that is permanent. What spiritual well-being means, or spiritual development, is moving from a point of selfishness to a point of unselfishness, ultimately leading to selflessness. So, how is that achieved? Well, this is achieved through the integrated spiritual disciplines. Now, this is a talk that takes at least an hour and a half to do. It takes up a few, maybe 3 or 4 chapters in the Bhagavad Gita. They talk about it. I'm trying to explain it to you in one slide. So when we talk about integrated spiritual disciplines, what we mean by that is, as a human personality, you have these 3 equipments: a body, a mind, and an intellect. So you need to look into each of these aspects. Now, with the body, we're not talking about a sort of physical health. Of course, yes, it is important for your overall sense of well-being to look after the body, eat well, exercise well, all of that. But with the body, you want to engage in what they call as karma yoga, path of action. All this means, don't worry about the wording. All this means is being of service. So your sense of well-being, your subjective sense of well-being is actually improved when you are in service of others. When you put others' interests and need before your own. By moving more and more and more, and it's not necessarily actually serving, having this disposition. Where can I serve? How can I be of service? It's not that you always have the opportunity. In fact, one of my colleagues once said to me, he said, having the opportunity to serve is rare. So it's not always there. But that doesn't mean we can't cultivate the spirit of service and sacrifice. That's the practice at the level of the body, at the level of action. At the level of mind, we already touched on this. It's this gratitude, this feeling of gratitude, this feeling of surrender to something I don't know. This is what they call as bhakti yoga, or the path of devotion. It helps soften the ego. Because when you appreciate all that you have, you're more likely to engage in benefiting others too. At the level of the intellect, jnana yoga, or the path of knowledge, the intellect examines the truth of life, tries to understand what is that reality, what is unreal, what is true happiness, what is real happiness, what is false happiness. Remember, the intellect has this ability to, or it's one of the faculty of discretion. It decides, it judges. So we use this in order to, and this is achieved through knowledge, through philosophy, through religion. We try and analyze the truths of life. Now, all these three together, all these practices together, and you will need to engage in all three, obviously at different levels, depending on the proportion of those within your personality. So a more physical person would need to engage more in karma yoga. A more emotional person, more in bhakti yoga. A more intellectual person in jnana yoga. Now, what all of these do essentially is start reducing the desires, the egocentric desires. Go back. Remember, less desires, less agitations, more permanent state of peace. So the more you're able to reduce your ego and egocentric desires, the less chances there of being unfulfilled desires. And those are what create the agitations, the displeasure in our lives. Furthermore, the practices reduce our sense of selfishness. This ultimately leads us to a state of happiness or subjective well-being. Finally, just to conclude, I remember the Swami, he always used to say, go out, go on, go and have a look in the world. Find me one selfish person that is happy. Also, try to find me one unselfish person who is unhappy.